Welcome to Commander Central episode 2 of 49, and today we'll be talking about listener Travis Cole's Marchesa the Black Rose list. I'm Dana.
I'm Max.
And I'm Chris.
So before we get into this, gentlemen, we're recording on a Monday for a Thursday show, which is kind of unusual. And I usually don't get to ask how everyone's weekend was, so how was everyone's weekend?
The snow's melting, and I have a lot of stuff I have to do around my house.
It's now become apparent all of you work involved in being a homeowner in the spring.
Yep. This is spring number 3?
I think so.
2 or 3, I don't remember now, but I just, I go outside and I look and I'm like, oh yeah, I have to do all this stuff. God, this sucks.
Yikes.
I got to grill out this weekend. That was my highlight of having nice weather and be able to cook some hamburgers in the grill. So that was just enough to make me feel good. Like the smell of the grill growing out, that was pretty great.
Very nice. Yeah, me and my roommate did the same thing. We grilled up some steaks on Saturday night. And then, we got to play some EDH on the Scrap Trawler stream last night with you, Dana.
We did.
I took the last game, and I tried to win the first game, but ran out of gas. But it was a fun game, fun hanging out with those guys as always. So thank you, Nick and Andy, for having us on to stream with you guys.
And I think on the show that airs next week, we're going to have a little announcement about giving away one of those decks, I believe, correct?
Yeah.
And I was actually thinking after we played, I went to bed last night, I'm going to make a $50 deck to have, and I've been thinking about some stuff I'm going to do with it. I'm going to build one with a $50 budget, kind of the same rules as Scrap Trawlers, the commander and the basic lands don't count. But I'm going to tag each individual card, because you can tag them in Archdeck, like you can make custom categories and stuff, with the price at the time. Because I don't want to have to go through, every 2
like
weeks.
We had to do, yeah.
Right, and change it. So when I put a card in the deck, that will kind of be a locked price for the card. And what I thought I would do is set up maybe a 10 card sideboard or something. So if I decide to pull a card out to put something else in, as long as it's in that 10 card sideboard, it stays at that price if I want to move it back in. But once I lose it from the sideboard, if it comes back in the deck later on, it has to go at whatever the current new price is.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it's a deck I can keep. I mean, I don't have to worry about if, Arcane Signet winds up not getting reprinted for 3 years and turns into a $6 card. I don't have to worry about making huge changes to a deck, but I also do have a budget cap when I brew it, because that was a fun thing to do, was build that kind of budget deck like that.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there. As someone who doesn't like to brew decks, putting that budget constraint is fun and challenging for someone like me, but I do enjoy it. It kind of gives you kind of a path you already have to go down versus just, hey, here's a commander, have fun.
Well, and it's one of those things too, if you're somebody like all of us who played in Return to Ravnica back in the day, and you just accidentally probably picked up 3 or 4 Cyclonic Rifts for 40 cents, it's really easy when you brew a blue deck to be I'm going to throw this Rift in because I just have one, and they cost me nothing when I got them. Whereas if you're brewing on a budget with those restrictions, you just can't put a Rift in. That's just what it is. Which on one hand, you're well, that sucks. I can't run this amazing card. On the other hand, it frees up a slot where you sometimes feel like I have to run Rift since I own one, and it's so strong. So yeah, I think I'm going to put together a little rules breakdown for things I'm going to do with that budget deck. But I think I'm going to build a $50 deck of some sort. I haven't figured out what yet, but that's a good way to have a deck.
I already have one built too.
Do you? Just accidentally?
Yeah, I'm going to put it up on Archdeck and see what it comes up with for price. Because I have a mono red Torbrand that I built for 1v1. And I know a lot of those red cards are not worth anything.
Yeah. Well, then that's a good way to have a deck too that plays pretty well with newer players. When you're just stuck at that budget, there's only so much you can do for your power for the most part. You could probably build a strong Edric deck for next to nothing, but usually you're going to be pretty power capped too, and that's a useful kind of thing to have lying around as well. So if you out there in listener land want to reach out to us and tell us about any games you've played or budget decks you've built, how'd you go about doing that, Chris?
You can find us on a multitude of social media platforms. You can find us on Twitter at CMDR Central. You can search us up on Facebook, CMDR Central. You can find us online at cmdrcentral.com, and you can also find us on YouTube by searching CMDR Central.
You can also head over to patreon.com/CMDR Central and check out our reward tiers, such as a Decks You Play episode. Otherwise, jump into our chat room to chat with us and the rest of the community and maybe play some VEDH with us.
yeah, it is a really good time being able to jump in that channel and just see games constantly happening, like even at odd hours. Monday morning at 10 o'clock, 3 people find a game or something. That's super cool. But we really appreciate any support we can get from you guys, even if that just takes the form of a like or an upvote or a listen. That all helps, and we appreciate it. So thanks to everyone, patrons, supporters, and the listeners alike. We appreciate it. Okay. Main topic today, let's kind of dive right in. Since this is a Thursday bonus show, we're going to be looking at Travis Cole's Marchesa the Black Rose list that's nicknamed Pet My Hair and Call Me Pretty, which is kind of what it looks like Marchesa is asking on that card. That's kind of funny. Max, why don't you tell us about what Travis told us about his deck?
Yeah, so Travis said that his meta is fairly battle cruiser-ish, so I like those type of metas, but it is transitioning into a bit more of an efficient / streamlined decks in the meta, but 2-card combos are frowned upon. The goal of the deck is to establish a board presence that can persist through multiple board wipes, and obviously Marchesa's ability helps with that.
Well, and then we always ask about weaknesses. And for all of you old-timers like myself and Dana and Max, back in the early 90s, maybe late 90s, you used to watch these like reality shows, and all you hear is bleep, 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 cutting out every other, cuss word. And that's exactly what we have on here, because he hates Rest in Peace. Rest in Peace is probably the killer of a deck like this. You add that with the board wipe and nothing you can do. So he's looking for some way to take care of that. Probably counterspell options due to the color combination that you don't really have removal for it. Also doesn't know what to cut for that. So we'll dig into that and see what we can come up with. There's also no budget restriction, but there is a caveat. He tends to put building restrictions on the decks to keep power, at that decent level, like most of us do. With his deck, he's trying to stick to the +1/+1 counters theme, but also Wizard Tribal. He's also trying to only use cards that have a foil version. So nothing before Urza Saga, I think it is.
I believe so, yeah.
Somewhere around in there. Unless it has synergy, or, of course, some of the new commander cards don't have foils. Right. So, of course, we can kind of be a little lenient with that.
Okay, so first things first here, I'm going to read out Marchesa in case anyone's forgotten, because at this point, Conspiracy 1 has been 6-ish years, I would say, if not even more than that now. It seems like it was recent, but it's not.
Oh, I remember drafting that set. It was so much fun.
It was a lot of fun. I think at least Max and I'm not sure if, I think you were there too, Chris. We all 3 were, now that I think about it. Went to, I think, a midnight release of that.
Yep.
So that was a good time.
2014.
Wow, 7 years now. Yeah,
7 years come June.
So Marchesa is 4 mana, 1 and Grixis, so 1 and a blue, a black, and a red for a legendary creature, human wizard, hence the wizard tribal sub-theme that got mentioned there in the beginning. She has Dethrone, so whenever this creature attacks a player with the most life or tied for the most life, put a +1 counter on it. Other creatures you control also have Dethrone, but the most important part here is whenever a creature you control with a +1 counter on it dies, return that card to the battlefield under your control at the beginning of the end step. Even if that creature isn't one you own, if you've taken control of a creature somehow, if it dies with a +1 counter on it, it comes back into play under your control. She's also a 3/3. She's a really, really solid commander.
Now, wasn't this the commander that when Homeward Path got the printing, we all started jumping on that because we had a person in our pod who played this all the time? And we're like, haha, no more of this. Homeward Path everything.
Yep. Yeah, this was one of the reasons I to this day still run Homeward Path in a lot of decks, from the Marchesa in particular, but there's a lot of those commanders that you're just going to lose your board state really fast if you don't have something like that out. So she is a really good commander, like I said, but one thing that's interesting about her, there's a lot of kind of different directions you can take this commander. We mentioned stealing stuff, like steal someone's card, sack it, have it come back into play under your control. I've seen that deck that steers heavily into that. I've seen ones that's built primarily around creatures with ETB abilities, whether it's making tokens or dealing damage or whatever it is. So the goal is to just recur those creatures repeatedly by sacrificing them with a +1 counter. They come back in play to get the ETB effect again, get a counter on them again, sacrifice them again, whatever. You can play her as a really effective stacks commander.
Oh, yeah.
Especially for the same reason, basically, because whatever you have to sacrifice, you get it back. So it's affecting other people way more than it's affecting you. I messed around with Modular a couple years back with her just for the fun of it, and worked fairly well, surprisingly. And this deck is doing all of that to a degree, kind of. And there's also some Wizard Tribal built in, so.
everything's in here, and it's like, oh boy.
Yeah, well, and that was the challenge. So we've discussed this in the past, but we might as well briefly mention it again. Sometimes people send us these decks to do, and they have legitimately like, I want to improve this from a meta, and we can go over and offer suggestions. Sometimes there's decks like this where number one is all foiled out, so clearly it's been together for a long time, and it's tough to offer suggestions for that reason alone. But number two, it's just clearly a deck that's been built and like agonized over. So there's also not a lot of room for cuts and improvements and changes. So we're probably going to have to lean more into this as kind of a show and tell to a degree, because the deck is so kind of tuned already, at least in terms of the power level he wants to hit.
Yes.
So first things first here, let's look at the lands. We're not going to read them all because there's 37 lands in here, which is a pretty solid amount for a 3-color deck. Are there any lands that you guys in particular want to call out or talk about that you find interesting? Max, how about you?
I find it interesting there's a Nykthos Shrine to Nyx in this list. Seeing that it's 3 colors. Personally, I haven't had a lot of luck with Nykthos in 3 colors, and I think Chris might be able to comment on that more since he's more of the 3-color player in the group.
I mean, unless you jam like your heart into 1 or 2 colors and the third color is just a splash, you could play it. But as per looking at this deck, it's pretty evenly split between all the colors.
Yeah, I mean, there's 43 black pips and 31 blue pips. So, I mean, black is a tad more prevalent in the deck, but that's still, it's a land that doesn't make colored mana unless you are set up for it. So I'm not sure how efficient that's going to be early in the game.
Now, one thing I will note, because that was my first thought too, and I do mostly agree, but I think one thing worth kind of commenting on here at least is the fact that there are only 4 instants and 3 sorceries in the deck. A lot of times when you see, these kind of decks too, there's also a lot more instants and sorceries. So that just means there's more permanence in this deck than you usually see, probably traditionally in most decks, which might be enough to make up for the fact that it's 3 colors and help that stick. There's also not a ton of artifacts. There's only 12 there. So you're looking at roughly half the deck being permanents. I still wonder how often it taps for a good amount of mana as well, but I do think as far as 3-color decks go, this one is probably closer to making Nykthos work than most.
Yeah.
True.
I also find it odd there's no like Mana Confluence or City of Brass. Granted, there are the fetch lands, but those at least help you knock your life down a little so you aren't on the throne. I know that tends to be an issue sometimes with Marchesa decks, is being stuck on the throne because everybody has realized what you're trying to do.
Yeah, definitely. In number one, those are great in any 3-color deck, period. I tend to feel like for the most part. But especially here, where like losing life is kind of a good thing a lot of times.
Yes.
They're that much better. So yeah, no, that's a really good point. Now, I believe the foil City of Brass is crazy expensive, but there's a lot of crazy expensive cards.
There was the new, was it buy box promo from Commander Legends?
Of Mana Confluence, at least, yeah.
Yep. City of Brass, not so much. I mean,
yeah,
you could probably get an altar done or something. But.
Sure. But yeah, no, that's a good catch as well, Max. How about you, Chris? Anything here worth talking about?
The big thing I was going to talk about was the Mana Confluence and City of Brass.
Okay.
The other thing I was going to talk about, seeing how there is no budget restriction on this deck, you could also consider maybe playing a couple more fetches in here too, to fetch shock cards, to put 3 damage on yourself to get even lower.
That's true.
And I know you have a lot of the expeditions in here and everything, and I hate to say it, but man, if you could get some more of those expeditions, it would look even better.
The couple things I will kind of highlight here. I do like Guild Mage's Forum here and Opal Palace.
Yes.
In particular because when I played a little bit of Marchesa with that modular deck, and having seen Marchesa played in the past, getting a counter on her gets tricky. She has no default way to do so you need an external way to put a counter on her, which is just great for protection, because then, obviously when she dies, she comes back into play, and people will want to kill her. So having ways to put counters on her so she survives the board wipe, because as long as she's out, it's pointless to remove your creatures for the most part, because they tend to always have counters on them. So people tend to gun for her, and having ways to put counters on her is very useful, particularly when it's on a land that has a pretty low opportunity cost. It's just in your deck, tapping for mana, and if you need it for a counter, you can put a counter on a creature. So I like both of those two. There are a couple other lands that do a similar thing. There's Forge of Heroes. It taps for colorless, and you can tap it to choose a target commander that came into play this turn and put a counter on it. So that's one more way to do it. There was Tyrite Sanctum in Kaldheim that taps for a colorless, and you can spend 2 mana and put a counter on a creature at any point in time, on a legendary creature, and that makes it into a god. What's nice about that one, maybe even more than Guild Mage's Forum, is you can do it after Marchesa dies and comes back into play without the counter on her. You can just put a counter on her again. So I think between those two, I think Tyrite Senkin would be a little bit better. Be tempted to try to find a slot for that just because I think it's such a good thing to have that option to put a counter on her.
Yep. The other thing I noticed with this is there are, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, right? 13 basic lands in this deck I think I came up with.
Yes.
Some around in there. This type of deck, unless you're running hard into a Blood Moon meta, it might be worth it to, cut down on your basics to add more of your pain lands or other lands that help you with the dethrone aspect, because you're so hard on that. Like, your deck runs off of that. And if you don't have something that's going to help you with that, then that might just cost you the game over a Blood Moon.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. The one land I was unsure about, and I'm wondering if you guys have any ideas, is Manamo, School at Water's Edge. And that's a land, legendary land.
A legendary.
And you can spend a blue to untap a legendary creature, or legendary permanent, excuse me. And there's a few, obviously there's Marchesa, and I think there's a few creatures in here. There's things like Bolas' Citadel, I guess. But I was just like looking at that, I'm like, I was having a tough time picturing how often it's that useful. Is there anything you guys see really?
I was looking for that earlier too when I was looking over this deck, and I'm not quite sure. Aside from, since this deck attacks so often, you get, your creatures get so big, it gives you the option of untapping to block if someone comes back at you.
Sure.
But other than that, I'm not really sure if there's a combo base in this. I don't see one per se. But then again, there's been combos in decks that we've done before like this, and all of a sudden we're like, at the end of the show, we're like, oh, hey, I found the combo.
The two things I noticed was Grimgrin doesn't untap unless you have a creature to sacrifice. So it's a way to cheat Grimgrin out. And if you have a Zombie Lady of Scrolls who lets you tap a wizard to draw a card, it's just a way to spend basically 1 mana, a 2, I guess, technically, because you have to tap the land too, to untap a zombie and tap her again to draw a card. So maybe there's enough synergy between like what you said, Chris, giving a creature pseudo-vigilance and a few things like that makes it worthwhile. But yeah, that was the one that really jumped out at me that I just wasn't entirely sure about. So, and I agree that with the basic thing too, like if talking about the City of Brass Mana Confluence thing Max mentioned, that's where you could put those in as drop, maybe 2 islands and just put those 2 in there.
Unless you're playing into a heavy meta that's playing like your Blood Moons or other, hate cards against lands, I would look into it.
Yep, I agree. Okay, let's jump over here and take a look at the instant sorceries. We'll do instants first, Max. What are the 3 that are in the deck?
The 3 instants in the deck are Chaos Warp, Mana Drain, and Thrilling Encore.
All really good cards.
Yeah, I mean, Chaos Warp solves any problem, and you are in colors that Grixis just has weird issues with removing enchantments in particular sometimes. So Chaos Warp is a way to deal with anything, including enchantments. Mana Drain obviously is insanely strong. Throwing Encore, for those who don't remember, was from Battle Bond, and it's an instant for 5 mana, 4 and black. Put onto the battlefield under your control all creature cards in all graveyards that were put there from the battlefield this turn. So it's a way to turn a board wipe into basically another Marchesa effect and grab a hold of all the stuff that just died that turn. So this is where, if you were looking to find room for counter spells to deal with those Leyline of the Voids or Rest in Pieces, you would put them in here. The one that jumped out at me that I would maybe try to find room for, even though it doesn't have a foil, is Fierce Guardianship, which is the counter spell that you can cast for nothing if you control your commander. Because this is a deck that really needs to have Marchesa out, and like we said, people are going to be gunning for her, and having the ability to, even if you're tapped out, just save her feels really good. Matter of fact, if I had in this particular deck, if I had to choose between a Mana Drain and a Fierce Guardianship, I think I would run Fierce Guardianship.
Nope, I have a different one.
Okay, what's yours here, Chris?
We talked about this last week on our wonderful show called Non-Blue Counterspells.
We did.
Withering Boon is actually a phenomenal counterspell. And as we brought up last week, it's 2 mana, 1 colorless and a black for pay 3 life, counter target summon spell. Granted, it doesn't counter anything, but the 3 life I think is way too good not to have.
Yeah, that's a useful thing to have just to get you off the throne.
Yep. I mean, there are other counterspells that I would prefer to play too, but that's just me.
I mean, and I'm going to go with the more traditional counter spells. So like Swan Song, if your main problems are enchantments, Swan Song will take care of that. And if you can get through with your creatures, that 2/2 bird you're giving them is not going to be a problem at all.
Yep.
I do think if he added a counterspell package, I would focus on ones that either can get cast for nothing like Fierce Guardianship or only have a single blue in the mana cost, like Swan Song or your Negate kind of things, just because in a 3-color deck, yeah, 3-color deck, double blue gets tricky sometimes to leave it open for sure.
Yeah, and while Mana Drain is a phenomenally powerful card, I've honestly seen people counter it and only get 2 mana out of it, and it's just... Or they hold it so long waiting for that 4 or 5 mana spell and have let so many things go through that it wasn't even worth it.
Yeah, I'm not going to say it's not fantastic, but in this particular deck, that can be kind of tough sometimes to have the mana free for it.
Yep, looking for efficiency over value.
Yeah. How about the sorceries, Chris? What are the 4 sorceries here?
We have 4 sorceries. 4 sorceries. Who plays only 4 sorceries? I'm not so sure about this one. We have Bribery, Damnation, Feed the Swarm, and Toxic Deluge. And I think the newest card is Feed the Swarm. For those that don't remember, that's the black, let's destroy enchantments and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, it's the sorcery version. Right. Well, it's the sorcery version of Chaos Warp. It's the way to deal with a thing that you have no other ways to deal with in these colors. So.
Yep.
Deluge and Damnation, 2 real solid, really efficient board wipes, and Bribery just lets you search target opponent's library and grab a creature card and take control of it. So we mentioned one of the themes you see in Marchesa decks a lot is stealing stuff. This is a way to do it with a sorcery in a Marchesa deck.
Yeah, and usually I guess the whole aspect of Bribery is to look at the person's commander and be like, okay, so this whatever black-red player or something, I guarantee they have, this card in their deck or something that's just as powerful as this, so I'm going to go for that one of their strongest cards, and now I'm just going to start beating with Marchesa and it never disappears from my side of the field.
Yep. Any thoughts here from anybody in particular? Do you have any ideas, things you like or dislike here, Max?
I like all of these. I think my only 2 cents would be Bribery over virtual EDH is going to cause some problems, but if this was in the before times where we can sit across from each other, I like all 4 of these and I wouldn't make any changes.
Yeah, my biggest thing for this, and Dana, I'm probably guessing you're going to say something about it too, because I know it's something we have discussed on other stuff, is there are because we're talking about instant sorceries, no card draw spells in this deck.
Yeah.
And you're in black, the best color to hurt your life total and draw cards at the same time.
Yeah.
There's nothing here.
And there's a few permanents that can do it, and we'll get to those when we get to that. We mentioned both Citadel already, and there's a couple things under enchantments. But those require you, for the most part, to put a thing in play and have it stay in play before you actually can draw cards. Sometimes you need options that just put cards in your hand.
Yeah, I mean, a Read the Bone, Night's Whisper, any of those would be awesome.
Yeah, and that makes them even better. Like, not only do those tend to be a little bit more mana efficient than blue cards, again, they get you off the throne.
Yep.
So this is a situation where it's almost like the paying the life on those Read the Bones or the Notion Rain or whatever is almost a positive here.
Yeah, and the more that I think about this, I'm basing all my judgments on this deck off of the one that I've played against.
Same here.
And maybe the meta that he is in playing wasn't quite as, weird as ours, where so much removal, so much other stuff. So this is more, because like you said, Battlecruiser, so they're already hitting each other so hard repeatedly that you don't need that kind of stuff.
Yeah, no, that definitely could be. So there's 7 enchantments here. We mentioned a few of them already, but we'll dig a little bit deeper. There's a Grave Pact for kind of an edict effect. When you sacrifice stuff, it burns everybody else. Leyline of Anticipation, so you can play at flash speed. A Necropotence, so you can draw cards. We talked about permanents that draw you cards. That's 1.
Yep.
Phyrexian Reclamation, where you can spend a colorless and a black and pay 2 life to return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So if something doesn't get recurred with Marchesa's ability, you can bring it back. Rhystic Study, draw cards and annoy everybody by saying, did you pay the 1? Sneak Attack, this is really kind of a perfect EDH sneak attack deck. You can put a creature from your hand onto the battlefield and gains haste. Presumably it will then get a counter when it attacks, so when it gets sacrificed at the end of the turn, it just comes right back into play. So Sneak Attack is so good in the Marchesa deck. And last but not least, Unspeakable Symbol, which is 1 and 2 black for an enchantment. You can pay 3 life and put a counter onto a creature. So
that's like the key card in this deck.
Yeah.
That's
knock yourself off the throne and put a counter on one of your creatures to make sure it gets recurred. It's so perfect. Thoughts on enchantments from anybody here? Maybe we can start with you, Max.
I like Sneak Attack. I like pretty much all of these except for maybe Leyline of Anticipation. I'm not quite sure what you want to be flashing in on other people's turns, knowing that this is your creatures need to attack to get those +1/+1 counters.
I mean, Leyline of Anticipation is never bad.
Right.
Valken Ori is never a bad card. But also at some point, when you're trying to do a really specific thing with the deck, those become the easiest things to cut, is those cards that are kind of like generically always useful, but aren't necessarily tying into this strategy that you want to be pulling off.
Agreed. And most of the times with Leyline and Vidalcan Orrery, though, too, you're playing more instants and sorceries, so you can cast spells over permanents, because your permanents are just going to die to other stuff, whereas your spells usually just go through.
One enchantment I've seen that's a huge pain in the butt to deal with in Marchesa decks is Grave Betrayal from back in Return to Ravnica. It's a 7-mana enchantment, so that isn't fun, paying 5 and double black. But whenever a creature you don't control dies, it returns to the battlefield under your control with a +1 counter on it, and that creature is a black zombie, which is kind of irrelevant. But basically, it does what you want. It takes everyone else's stuff for you automatically, and it gives you the dethrone counter immediately. So if it dies again, you still get it back. 7 mana is a lot, though, but it kind of gives you a backup if someone steals your Marchesa or something, or she's been killed so many times that it's prohibitive to recast her. Grave Betrayal gives you kind of a backup of her ability.
Yes.
So that's one. I don't know if it fits this deck necessarily. I just wanted to throw it out there as a possible option. But myself, as far as enchantments go, this is a pretty solid suite. Again, we mentioned some people play it as a stacks deck. A Grave Pact, this deck is splashing almost all of the Marchesa stuff, and Grave Pact is the version of stacks in this deck. So
I might swap out Grave Pact for Dictate of Erebos, just to get rid of the triple black pip and do a double black pip and 1 more mana. I mean, being able to, I do believe it has flash too, so you can put it in when you need it type of deal.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, for 1 more mana, you can flash it in. It's a little bit easier to cast.
Yep.
Yeah, no, that's actually not a bad call. I kind of agree with that.
I do think this is a great deck for a card like Greed or Arguel's Bloodfast. Those enchantments that you can just pay mana, pay some life, draw a card. The benefit of the one from Ixalan is it flips into a land that taps for black, and you can sacrifice stuff to gain life back. If it is at the end of the game and it doesn't really matter if you're on the throne or not, you just need life to stay in the game. That's kind of clutch, in my opinion.
Yep. No, yeah, that's a good point.
I was also thinking, our typical Phyrexian Arena type of card.
Sure, yeah.
Every turn, 1 life type of deal. I mean, I've watched people have Phyrexian Arena out, and most of the time, they're always 2 to 3 life less than the rest of the field.
Yeah, and it, helps with that, the Nykthos kind of thing as well, because double black, but that also makes it trickier to cast. Well, 6 of one, half dozen of the other, but...
Yep.
All right, artifacts. Max, why don't you tell us what we have here?
Yeah, we have a dozen artifacts. So there's an Arcane Signet, Ashnod's Altar, the Bolas' Citadel we've already mentioned, Chromatic Lantern, Lightning Greaves, Mana Crypt, Phyrexian Altar, Soul Ring, all 3 Talismans, and the Ozolith.
I have no complaints whatsoever about this entire suite. The only one that's a little bit hard, I think, out of all of them is probably Bolas' Citadel, but the rest of the suite is perfect.
Yeah, you've got ramp in artifact form here. You have sack outlets that don't tap, so you can use them repeatedly over and over again, and they give you mana to use to do whatever you're doing. Obviously, Mana Crypt and Soul Ring are pretty great. Greaves protects Marchesa. Chromatic Lantern fixes your mana and works as ramp as well.
Yep.
And the Ozolith is just a crazy card.
The Ozolith just needs to be in here.
Yeah, that's actually maybe the one that is good as it is. This deck probably isn't necessarily winning via +1 counters, which is where Ozolith really shines. In this case, it's probably just protecting your +1 counters by letting you put them onto a creature if you're not in the throne or something. But it's also only 1 mana, so...
Yeah, I could see it too where, because how does it read? So whenever a creature you control leaves the battlefield, if it had counters on it, put those counters onto the Ozolith. So... if you have a sack outlet out, you have 3 creatures that attack. They all have dethrone, whatever. They get the counters. You sack them off. Well, you had already cast a creature that turn that didn't have haste. So all those counters go on Ozolith. Well, then the next turn you can put all those counters onto, other creatures or something like that. It's just a way to pump up 1 or 2 creatures and make them more powerful as needed.
Well, or even if you are somehow ahead of everybody else on life, or so you're not going to be able to hit somebody who's on the throne, it gives you a way to, before combat even, okay, I'm going to sacrifice these creatures to get their ETB abilities or whatever it is, move to combat and put the +1 counters back on them before you swing, so they survive if people have blockers up or whatever too. So, or even if you don't swing, just so they have the counters back for next turn. So I guess, I see the utility of it, particularly at 1 mana.
Yeah, you can't complain at 1 mana. I mean, I can't believe they printed a card like this.
Okay, yeah, but I don't know if I would add anything else. We've mentioned this before, this deck is so tightly tuned that I just don't know if there's a lot of room for anything else here.
I looked hard for really good artifacts, and I didn't see anything that would really stand out to me for this type of deck. Because he has everything covered. I like the swap of into the talismans over the signets. I mean, you have the sacrifice outlets. You have so much mana ramp in there. I mean, it's beautiful to me.
Yeah. So, Planeswalkers, briefly, there's only one in the deck. It's Nicol Bolas Planeswalker, which was the first Bolas. It's the 8 mana that comes into play with 5 loyalty. Destroy target non-creature permanent, which is his +3. His -2 is gain control of target creature. And -9, Nicol Bolas Planeswalker deals 7 damage to target player or Planeswalker. That player or that Planeswalker's controller discards 7 cards and then sacrifices 7 permanents.
The Altar of Ugin.
Yep.
Yeah, and this is just a absolute bomb if you get it out and drop it. And if you're playing Grixis, it's just a powerful, fun card to play.
I think this card fits well into this deck.
Yeah.
It's pretty much an 8 mana. I'm going to start stealing all your stuff, and then when the loyalty gets down low enough, I'm going to start blowing up everything and just keep doing this over and over again.
Exactly. Yeah, +3 to destroy something is fantastic.
For sure. I mean, I totally get why it's in the deck. It deals with the problems that Grixis can't, it hits those enchantments.
Yep.
If I actually had to suggest a second Planeswalker, and this kind of goes back to Chris talking about there's not a lot of draw in the deck, I would recommend Liliana Dreadhorde General. Just with her static of whenever a creature you control dies, draw a card. You're going to be looping these with sack outlets and whatnot over and over. So just get a lot of value off of it.
Tokens, too, that you could potentially need.
Yeah, she creates zombies for chump blockers. Her -4 is everybody sacrifices 2 creatures, clears the way. And then her alt at -9 is each opponent chooses a permanent they control of each type and sacrifices the rest.
Yeah, no, that's actually a really good call as well. I mean, that's probably as strong as Bolas almost for what in this particular deck, particularly that passive ability to draw you cards.
And it's 2 less mana.
Yeah, exactly. Last but not least, particularly because there's 35 of them here, is the creature suite. And I will just briefly read them all off, and we can then talk about what we like or dislike or anything like that. There's a Nanthiamancer, an Apprentice Necromancer, Arcbound Reclaimer, a Zombie Lady of Scrolls, who we discussed, a Bloodline Necromancer that is a vampire wizard. When it enters the battlefield, you may return target vampire or wizard card from your graveyard to the battlefield, so kind of a recursion loop machine there. Blood Tracker, Burnished Heart, it's ramp that you can recur. Carrion Feeder, which is a sacrifice outlet. Champion of Wits, which is something that can be recurred either with Marchesa's ability or with an Eternalize and does draw cards there. Clever Impersonator, just a good way to copy stuff. Same with Dax Duplicate. Disciple of Bolas, draw on a body. Falconwrath Aristocrat has a sacrifice outlet kind of baked in, and it puts counters onto stuff. Flare the Hatebound, just an effective creature that has Undying, so it comes back into play with a +1 counter on it. Glenalandra Archmage, which is a nice counter spell on a body that has Persist, so if you have a way to put a counter on it with Marchesa's ability, it washes out that Persist counter and can be repeatedly reused. Grey Merchant, obviously, is the king of recurring creatures for damage. Grim Harspec's going to draw you a card when stuff dies. We mentioned Grimgrin, it's just a good value body, but Grimgrin gets counters as well. Kukushko, the original Grey Merchant. Metallic Mimic, is going to do wizard stuff, essentially, because it comes into play as a creature type, and it's going to let other creatures you control that are wizards come into play with counters on them. Machias, again, is going to interact with +1 counters and gives your creatures Undying, so they get +1 counters as well. Noxious Gearhulk, great way to just blow stuff up, and then you recur it and blow up more stuff. Profaner of the Dead is a way to kind of use it as a sacrifice outlet because it does have exploit built in, and it's a way to return creatures to owner's hands if they have less power than Profaner, so it's a way to kind of repeatedly bounce boards. Puppeteer Click is just a way to recycle stuff from other people's graveyards. Again, it has Persist, so you can put a counter on it and get rid of that -1 counter. River Kelpie just is a way to gain some value from stuff going into the graveyard. Persist again. Sage of Fables here. Each other wizard you control comes into play with a +1 counter on it, so it's a way to put a counter on Marchesa, and you can remove counters from something to draw a card. Solemn is a good recursion creature to draw and ramp. Soul Diviner lets you remove counters from something to draw a card. Soul of Temptation, when it ETBs, you can gain control of a creature, so that's something that's nice to be able to blink repeatedly. Spark Double is a good clone again. Tempest Caller, when it comes into play, you tap all creatures a person controls. So if you have a way to put a counter on it, sacrifice it, blink it with Marchesa, not blink it, but have it come back into play, you can lock down boards pretty effectively. Trophy Mage is just a recurable tutor here. It's going to go get some of the artifacts that you need, particularly the sacrifice outlets here, and you can reuse it a few times. Venzer is a good reusable body to counter spells or bounce permanents. Viscera Seer is just one of the best sack owlets on a body ever printed. And Yahenni, also a sack owlet on a body and is a really effective creature as well. 35 creatures, all of which are pretty good. Now, we talked about a couple things like adding maybe a few counter spells or whatever. If I was to make cuts and put things in, it would probably be here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And any particular ones you guys think you would take out if you were going to replace things?
I have quite a few cards.
Okay.
I don't know if I would like take them out. Others, but like a Falconwrath Aristocrat, it doesn't quite fit the theme of the Wizards. It doesn't do too much. Yes, it gives it indestructible, does all that. You have a sack outlet there, but you have sack outlets on other stuff. So
Right.
why not go into, put in cards that are more, can help you in the long run of the game. What I did was swap creature for creature just to keep his creature suite the same.
Okay.
So, I like Agar the Freezing Flame, which is actually a new card from, what's the new set? Kaldheim?
Kaldheim.
Yep. Wow. I've been looking at Time Spiral Remastered spoilers so much that I forgot what the newest set was that's out. So for 3 mana, 1 colorless, red and a blue, you get a 3/3 giant wizard. And whenever a creature or planeswalker an opponent controls is dealt excess damage, if a giant wizard or spell you control dealt that damage this turn, you draw a card. So with Dethrone, your creatures are getting big. The counter aspect, and if anyone chump blocks and you deal excess damage, you just draw a card because all your creatures are wizards usually.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just a nice card draw outlet. I have other ones. I'll let you guys go into what you guys have first before I bring up the other ones.
How about you, Max?
So I would start. I'm kind of doing the opposite of Chris. I'm going more of the battle cruiser way than sticking with Wizard Tribal, but the cards I do have deal with +1/+1 counters. I'm not a big fan of Arcbound Reclaimer because it is the only modular card. It's a little different from when Dana, you built yours, you kind of had all of them, which helps.
Right.
So I think I would get rid of this, a 4-mana 2/2 that lets you kind of move the counters around or remove them to get an artifact out of your yard on top of your library. I would cut that for something like Jury Master of Review. This is from Commander Legends. It's a red and a black for a 1/1 human shaman. But whenever you sacrifice a permanent, put a +1/+1 counter on Jury. And when Jury dies, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. So plop a couple +1/+1 counters on it. Do the loop with Marchesa. You're going to hit someone for 2 or 3 every time that goes off. As long as you get the counters on it. And it has a sacrifice outlet built into it. So, whenever you sacrifice a permanent. So whenever you do your Marchesa stuff, this gets bigger. Then you sack this last and hit someone for 10 or 12.
And I actually went the other route with the same exact card, Max. I went for Archaeo Mender, which is a 3-mana wizard as a 2/3. From Jumpstart that when it enters the battlefield, you return target artifact from your graveyard to your hand. So you're getting the same ability of returning artifacts, except for it's going to your hand instead of the top of the library.
Very nice.
Granted, you're not getting the whenever you wanted, but with the Dethrone and your other sack outlets, you could just do it repeatedly anyways.
Yeah. So my next one is Emmerstrum Predator. This is a new dragon from Kaldheim for 2 red and a black. It's a 3/3 flyer, and whenever it becomes tapped, exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard and put a +1/+1 counter on Emmerstrum Predator. And then you can also sacrifice another creature and it gains indestructible until end of turn, but you tap the Predator. So just a nice flying dragon that's going to get bigger just because of what you're doing in your deck.
Jeez, you're not sticking to wizards, homie. You're not sticking to the wizards.
+1/+1 counters was first in the notes.
No, see, I got another nice wizard. This is another one from Kaldheim. It's a new one, and this is actually an uncommon, so it might be easier to find. Probably find in foil, although it's probably curled into a Pringle by now because of the new foiling process. But this is called Basalt Ravager. It's a 4-mana, 3 colorless, and a red for a 4/2. And when it enters the battlefield, it deals X damage to any target. So you can hit a player or a planeswalker with this, where X is the greatest number of creatures you control that share creature type in common. So if you're sticking to the wizard theme and seeing how this is a giant wizard, comes into play, guaranteed to deal 1 if he's the only one in play. But any other wizards you have in there, just gravy on top. That just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
Sure.
And you just start blasting stuff. And this is also one of those aspects where you can start, sacrificing this. It comes back into play, triggers again. Kind of similar to like the Flare of the Hatebound type of deal, but just another option of that.
Yeah. I mean, I would say my replacements would take out the other non-wizards in the deck. So like the Predator could replace something like Burnished Heart, because unlike Solemn Simulacrum, when you bring Burnished Heart back with Marchesa's ability, you don't automatically go get a land. You still have to have 3 mana to do its thing. Where,
yes,
you could just loop a sad robot over and over, kind of like I do in Brago, and just rip all your basics out at a slower pace.
True. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yep.
The couple of creatures, and I didn't, most of the ones I was like, okay, this is good here. I would look and like, oh, it's already in the deck.
Yeah.
For the most part, the one that jumped out that I was thinking was Sepulchral Primordial, which is kind of a hyped up version of Puppeteer Click, where you can get stuff from everyone's graveyard with it.
Okay.
You have to put a counter on it. Obviously, it doesn't come back itself like Puppeteer Click does, but if you get a counter on it, you can, sacrifice it and have it come back and grab a bunch of other stuff again. So that's an absolute bomb in this kind of deck, and it's one that I would maybe find room for. The other main things I was just going to point out, though, are the clones. Clones are kind of a bit like the Leyland Anticipation that we talked about, where it's just generally good. Like, a clone is never bad, but I don't know if... They're also variable. Like, you never know if there's going to be a really good target or there's going to be a not a good target.
Yeah.
Whereas like counterspell is always going to be good, or something that's like you just know what the flat number is going to be. A negate is always going to save your butt at some point in time, or Swan Song or something. Clever Impersonator you might have in your hand and look around and might go 4 turns where you never have anything worth copying. Whereas a counterspell is just always there as protection. So if I was going to add a couple of counterspells, I would go through and take out a couple of the clones. Maybe not Dax Duplicate, because at least it has a way to put a counter on itself. But Clever Impersonator, as great as it is, those are the kind of ones I might wind up pulling out, because they don't necessarily help with what the deck is doing as much as having the option to save your own butt with a counterspell.
True.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there, Dana, and I think there are 3 clones in this deck: Clever Impersonator, Dax Duplicate, and Spark Double. I do think Clever Impersonator, if I were to cut any of the clones, would be the first one to go, because at least Spark Double and Dax Duplicate have ways to put +1/+1 counters on themselves, and Spark Double lets you copy Marchesa, so now you can do it twice.
Yep.
Well,
so
maybe.
that's really my feedback that I had here, because the deck is just so well put together, and it has been clearly been like had a lot of time with him sanding off the edges to get it to function as smoothly as it does.
Yes.
Any final thoughts from either of you two?
I have one other creature I would jam in this deck, and I would make room for it no matter what.
Okay.
And that's Flesh Carver, which is a 3-mana 2/2 wizard with Intimidate. Has a 2-mana sacrifice another creature, put 2 +1/+1 counters on it, and then when it dies, you put an XX Black Horror creature token in the battlefield where it's what its power is. It's just another sack outlet, gets you double value off of your other sacrifice effects, all of that stuff. Other than that, overall, this deck was probably one of the hardest ones that I've had to go through, just due to the simple fact that it is so nicely tuned in here.
Yep.
And holding it back to wizards and just +1/+1 counters was really hard. And I love that that's the route that you took with this deck. I love the caveat, the holding yourself back, because this deck could be 100 times worse than it is.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, like we kind of talked about that before we even started, where I was wanting to build a budget deck for that reason. This kind of, when you build yourself a couple hard rules in a deck, it does force you to think a lot more about what you're going to put in it. And I think it winds up a lot of times being more fun because of that, because you have to get creative.
Yep. I do got to say, when I looked at this deck and I saw the restrictions that he had put upon this, I immediately thought, well, this should be a humans deck. No wizards. This should just be humans. And then I started brewing this in my mind of what I would play as humans. Sure. And I'm like, oh, this deck would be horrible. Maybe I should never build a deck like this.
Any last thoughts from you, Max?
I really like this deck. I like that it gives you, as an opponent, it gives you the challenge of facing a Marchesa the Black Rose deck without facing that Marchesa the Black Rose deck. So, like, to kind of reiterate on what you guys said, the limitations of wizards and +1/+1 counters is huge. There is a little wiggle room to play in there. Like we said, cut some of the clones, or then maybe the non-wizards for some counter spells or some draw, or even some more +1/+1 counter shenanigans. But I really like this deck, and hopefully through virtual EDH we get to play against it one day.
For sure. The only thing I would always say is these are fun to do in different ways. Sometimes it's fun to look at a deck and like try to figure out how you can tweak it and make it better. This is one where someone's kind of showing you their child. This is the baby that I made that I've spent years and years crafting and putting together and finding like the perfect piece of bling. And it's just fun to look at. This is someone's classic car that they're showing you that's like polished down to perfection with the perfect 5 layers of wax on it. Was just fun to look at. So I want to say thank you to Travis for sharing this with us. It was a pleasure to dig into.
Yes, it definitely was. This is definitely that deck where, and Dana, I know we had this happen once with one of your decks, where people do not put open drinks or beverages on the counter or the table next to this deck.
So glad I double sleeved when that happened. All right, that is going to wrap up this Thursday show. If you want to find me on the interwebs, I'm on Twitter at Dana Roach. You can find Max at CMDRCentral_Max, and you can find Chris at WiseSquishy1. Our show is edited by Rafael Garcia, and you can find him at Ursa Bearwalker. And our podcast theme is Retro Future Dirty by Kevin MacLeod, licensed via Creative Commons. We'll be back on Monday with a brand new show. Until then, I am Dana.
I'm Max.
And I'm Chris.